All right, I believe we are live. Okay. Um, Sound check. Can you hear me okay, Dario?
Yes, I can hear you okay. Can you hear
Wonderful.
me?
Yep, I can.
Excellent.
Okie doke. All right. Um, First, just wanted to welcome you to the show. So excited to chat this particular conversation. I think has been a long time in the making. There's since I discovered sort of personality typology at this deeper level a few years back, I've had conversations, across the board about, what this is, right? How to use it. Is it real? I think there's more conversation than understanding of what they are, and so I wanted to, invite a conversation with one of the preeminent living scholars and scientists behind personality typology, who has studied it from has pioneered research in neuroscience in approaching personality type from this new angle, in addition to the many decades studying it from more classic methods. So really excited to have this conversation, and maybe starting from the beginning. If you love a good story, how did you come to discover your personality typology?
Yeah, absolutely. So this year will be, I guess, my 30th anniversary. And by the way, thank you for having me on. It's a pleasure to sometimes just go back and review the whole journey that's been here and why and where are we going. It began in a small way a little bit before that with some friends of mine sort of speaking the strange code and sitting there doing people watching and analyzing our friends. And I'm like, what are you talking about? And long story short, that led me to get this sort of first certification in psychological testing, which was outside my wheelhouse, which started off as engineering. Eventually, I even did my PhD still in system science and industrial engineering. I think that's very important because one is that I'm coming from an application perspective. So engineering is always about, does it work? It's not about, is the theory sound good, or are we following like the traditional methodology? Or although in my neuroscience stuff, like I do follow very much like the usual things that people do. Um, and just the whole thing, it's like, wow, so there's a way to look at what people are doing and to name it that goes beyond just generic adjectives like industrious or open-minded, extroverted, whatever it is, which are fine, but that's like describing an apple from the outside. And I think if we want to understand personality, psychology, the psyche, then we need to think more like an apple orchard farmer, and want to understand ecology, like the inside and out, because people are complicated. They're more than just the surface traits that are there. So yeah, and then it was around 2006 that I had won a teaching award, and I got some matching grant money, and they're like, you have to spend it on something here at the university. It was at UCLA, and so I decided to start a lab. We got the brain imaging equipment, and it so happened on campus that one of the people on the California board for like a neuroscience research was there, and I could talk to him and get advice. And I started using EEG, electroencephalogram, brain imaging technology. And the first few years were just exploratory, doing stuff with students and learning how it all works. And quite a bit has happened since then. It's somehow that was like 17, 18 years ago.
Wow.
Yeah.
Yeah, that's amazing. Wow. Yeah, it's great when things align like that. That you were able to do this incredible research. So you brought some really interesting terms, and I think it'd be really interesting to start kind of breaking this down. You mentioned traits, right? Personality traits. Can you talk about like what the difference is between a personality trait and say a type or a system model? Like what does that mean?
Yeah.
Yeah.
Yeah, no, that's a really great question, because I would say Unlike a lot of things in science where it's the scientists who are really on top of things and the public is confused, I would say it's the opposite, that here there's a lot of people in academia who are confused and the public is not really confused. The public simply takes like either what's popular or what works for them, like in a corporate setting, something like that, that meets their needs. Personality psychology used to be richer than it is today. And today I would say that the discipline is really quite narrow and it's all about measurable traits that people have. So measurable trait is like a surface behavior, and you can think of it like an adjective or a descriptor. So people are amicable, they're thrifty, they're close-minded, and we could put that on a scale of how much or how little they are thrifty or honest or whatever it is. There are different models for things, and that's fine. That's a way to describe people. But I don't think it leads to any understanding, and there's no real appreciation that actually we have brains and we have a nervous system, we have a social environment, and that all of that is interactive. So my background is, even though it's engineering, still it comes from quite a bit of cognitive science. So I'm not actually a personality science person. I'm actually a cognitive science person. And my background is originally in AI and then getting into neuroscience. And so what is the difference? The cognitive science wants to know how things function. So we have mental functions. And that's what appealed to me about Carl Jung, albeit 100 years ago, but still at that time, a century ago, he was looking at verbs, functions that people engage in. We do sensing, we sense the environment, we take in information, we're metabolic, we're animals, and as people, we process information in some way. And we engage many different mental functions. So in decision making, for example, you can have like a convergent thinking, a divergent thinking. There's a bunch of ways to talk about the kinds of sort of mental activities that we do. And that's something that appealed to me, even though Myers-Briggs is like an Americanized, simplified version of what Jung did. It still talks about mental functions. And that's a really great thing. So the difference is that traits are just like this sort of surfacey kind of behavior, like pretty, how pretty on a scale of 1 to 10. We all know that like popular kind of like high school thinking, or middle school thinking. And this is asking for something that's like, no, how do we function in the social world and the physical world? Like, how do our brains work? How do we take in information? And then I know, looking at the brain, for example, that we have executive regions in the brain. We have like a goal-focused CEO. We have an open-ended CEO. We have some way to manage those, sort of balance them out. Like, what happens when we make decisions? How does that work? What happens when we take in information or track a process? So that's where I'm coming from with it. And that's a more like systems approach rather than a trait approach.
Yeah, that's really interesting. I mean, it's as big a difference between an adjective and a verb, right? Like, right, traits are about sort of singular snapshots of these dimensions that often I think are associated with some sort of value judgment, right? Conscientiousness, right? Is low. There's always a better than, right? High in or agreeableness. Rarely is. Is it seen to be a good thing, right? From a value judgment perspective, right? To be very neurotic or, very unconscientious or extremely disagreeable, right? Whereas the functions, right, the cognitive processes are neutral, right? They just describe what's going on. Like, what thing in the brain are you using to take in this bit of information, right? And then what are you doing to process it or make a decision, right?
Yeah, absolutely. And I feel like today, when we're talking about not just say an academic environment or corporate environment, we're sort of limited, looking at people in a limited context, that we want to go into different countries. Like I just came back from doing brain imaging in Tokyo and Singapore, and then from there going to North Carolina and talking about some of the things we saw. Looking at doing the brain imaging and just talking about the personality and getting to meet people in the Denmark and Norway, France, the UK, India, even within the United States. There's lots of different, I want to call them subcultures. And they aren't even necessarily ethnic or whatever they are. I mean, it's just like you could talk about class, you can just talk about the interests that people have, like however you want to talk about it, but there are people everywhere and there's a lot of diversity. So instead
Absolutely.
of coming in and saying like the best kind of person is, and then
Exactly.
naming that, like they should be more extroverted and more conscientious and whatever, and there's a value judgments there. Let's just explore the
Yeah.
ways that people process information, because all of those ways are part of survival. Like they help their strategies for survival, and they have value, and they contribute and have contributed and will contribute. And that's the beautiful thing, is that when Jung described these 8 mental functions, sometimes people think there are 4, but actually there are 8. Um, that he didn't say some of these are better than others, or that we should like highlight these and discourage these other ones. He's like, these are all the ways, looking cross culturally as best he could,
Yeah.
whether it was Navajo, or going to India, or different parts of Europe, or wherever it was, United States, and really valuing each one of those. Like, what did they look like? What are these mental processes like? And
Yeah.
as well as how did they go wrong, each one of them? And what does it look like as part of a developmental picture?
Mhm.
It's not like they're just mental processes and we're just looking at this in a very, like, their programming code. Uh,
Right.
he had patients. The people came to him, they were in distress.
Yeah.
And so for each of their gifts, instead of trying to force them to, let's make everybody like this,
Yeah.
he's like, okay, so what are they doing sort of wrong within the context of their own lives and their own gift? And then how can we help them, like bootstrap them to return to who they are?
Exactly. Yeah. I think that's a really key point, that the sort of normalization versus and sort of um, difference as a euphemism for not the modal type of person, right? The modal this, or the modal way to be, right? The most popular way, the most common way, but meaningful differences, right? That I think there's I've always had an interesting almost distant relationship with sort of traditional measures of identity, right?
Mhm.
Your gender, where you grew up, your skin color, whatever, your hair color, and when I discovered this this system, this of personality type, um I felt that felt the most kinship that I had with anyone, was with the people that process information most similarly, right? Because
Mhm.
it felt like talking to a mirror when I realized they had the exact same quirks, the exact same struggles. Like, why can't I? Why am I so weird that I can't do this? Or like, why is this just like a struggle? Or why do I have
Mhm.
a knack for this? And those those differences, right? That's not a euphemism, like, oh, you're different, right? You're outside of this bell curve, right? That's really what normal means, right?
Mhm.
Belonging on the normal curve, right? Which kind of everyone does, right? Every data point is on the curve, right? But ways that we're different in that it gives us almost like a different, like, measuring stick, right? Instead of trying to be that middle spot, right? Trying to be just the best version, or just the best functioning version of that type, right?
Mhm. Yeah, yeah, and so there's some, many people have been doing research in this area for a century, and especially since some in the 50s through the 80s, and a lot more in the 90s and 2000s. Um, and there's this question always about, like, Jung's original research, or the Myers-Briggs type indicator, or things that are related to that.
Mm.
Um, they're like, oh, there's no research out there, or is just some quiz on the internet, or whatever it is. I'm like, wow, actually, the story is the exact opposite. That the MBTI assessment, the official one, is the most researched personality assessment and most published about in the world.
Mm.
And it has a lot of stuff going back quite a ways. I mean, to the 40s and 50s,
Wow.
um, as well as continuing to evolve. So in the late 90s, for example, it was completely redesigned from the ground up by academic psychometricians in
Mm.
universities, psychologists, saying like, okay, how do we approach this to make it like a modern instrument and meet all of the criteria of a modern instrument, to help people. And and that's where, so there is that science part of it and that research part of it that's there, as well as my own research, which is really two different paths. I mean, the neuroscience part, and then there's just like the cognitive processes assessment, and sort of like validating in a very traditional statistical way. But also this idea of helping people, like if we go back to the roots of it, what is the purpose of it? And the purpose is not to analyze and then sort of like, oh, well, where do we go from there? Oh, we've just labeled them. Maybe we can predict what they do in the future with the correlation study. Like, I don't know. I mean, those are interesting questions for some people in academia. But for everybody else, we want to know, even for ourselves, like, what does this say about me? And how does this help me? And what are the applications? And from the original Jung's work all the way through Isabel Myers, and then heading into the end of the last century through now, has all been about what are the applications. And the applications are so rich and so powerful, and there's definitely enough space for like the personalization and the individual diversity. That's where I think it really shines, is that nobody feels judged by it. The language is very easy to use. There's still a lot of diversity. It's not just like there are 3 kinds of people in the world. No. And it really has a lot of merit in that sense.
Definitely, definitely. I see it as almost this like manual that to being human that we never got, right? We were just kind of born, and everything we figure out by failing, right? We fall down, we're like, okay, well, don't do that again. Or, oh, be careful there, don't touch that again. But when it comes to our minds, right, and how we interact with the world, right, how we take in information and then process it, metabolize it, make decisions, it seems like we're always trying to just do what most people do, right? And so there's always the I think in education is like a really good example of this, right? Where back in the day, decades ago, the assumption was everyone, all minds are the same, everyone learns the same, right? Same curriculum, right? If you're to this, then you're disruptive. If you're to that, you're not this enough, right? There's like kind of one metric, right? As I think it was Albert Einstein who said, if you judge a fish by its ability to climb a tree, it's going to think it's stupid, with its entire life. And so, on the reverse, sometimes these days, the other belief is that we're all so unique, right? And we have to kind of, cater a specific program to each person. But I think there's the truth is somewhere in between, right? Where there are these patterns, right? There's these finite kind of types, right? These types that use their brains in the same sort of order of dominance, these processes in the same orders of dominance, and you can use that almost like a map, right, to your own development, it seems.
Yeah. And I think sometimes we don't even need to use the full richness of the model. We can even use a model in a simpler way, like it's a great, honor to have won a teaching award at UCLA in 2011. And I figured it was an opportunity when they interviewed me, because they asked, like, what is the secret of your teaching? And I actually went back and thought about personality, because that's what I took very seriously as a teacher. And in that case, it's not like I'm trying to cater to all 16 types or whatever as I'm teaching. But I do keep in mind 4 things to try and include in every class that should reach everybody. Like, everyone will relate to at least one of those things, and to include it just enough, even though one of those things was something that I would rank last. And personally, if I were a student, I would find that irritating if that was, really irritating if that was the only thing that the class had. But nonetheless, I knew statistically from the body of research and millions of people out there that was actually something that a lot of students like. They want memorization. They want something to memorize. That doesn't mean it's the only thing we're going to do. But I'm like, there are 4 things you can do. Did anybody listen? I don't think so. Which is really unfortunate, because I'm like, I don't know. It's like making a pizza. People will invest lots of time to figure out how to make a pizza or a pie, or to fix their car, decorate their house, or to play a musical instrument. but God forbid they should spend 5 minutes adjusting how they operate just when they're in a position of responsibility, especially. And responsibility could be in a romantic relationship, it could be as a manager, as a teacher, whatever it is, to simply like be a little bit more inclusive and expand how they operate, to put a little bit more out. And I'm like, you don't need to know a whole fancy system, like just these 4 things to keep in mind. And I found it helped a lot. I mean, it really is something that everybody in the class is sort of satisfied. And on the other hand, I've also found with the neuroscience that we don't need to stop at 16 types. That's just simply like a convenient, it's a very convenient spot. Like it's a lot of cognitive diversity, but it's not too much. Do we want to go to 32 or 64 or with like MBTI step 2, there are these scales of like gregariousness and like they add in some traits with it. I'm like, if you want to do that, you can get to a lot of individual variation. And in some things like career counseling or trying to understand, the person is like, well, I feel like this most of the time, but some other times I'm like that. I'm like, of course you are, because everybody has 2 hands. We have 2 hands. We have a preferred hand. I happen to be right-handed. And then we have non-preferred hand, and we use both of them. And so, it can be good sometimes to get to like a much deeper level of detail if the person's open to that. And so that's what I love, is that there really is like a range of things that we can talk about that meets the needs of the situation.
Yeah, that's a good point. Like, what's the appropriate tool, right, for the problem at hand, right? And what's the most sort of Pareto efficient, right? If you need 99% detail, right, or if you just need a rough 80%, right? What's the 20% tool that you can use, right? Maybe it's not 16, maybe it's just 8 or 4. So maybe we can say like classes in session, and for anyone who's new to the system, right? What's like the introductory way to use it that's still accurate, right? That's not reliant on any false understandings or dichotomies that may not be so helpful or even accurate. What's the simplest way to understand personality type?
That's a really good question. I would generally warn everyone. First of all, I'm Gen X, so my experience growing up was the outdoors, not the internet. So I don't come to the internet with the belief that everything worthwhile is free and it only exists if it's on the internet. That's not really true. That there's a world that existed before 1994. And there's a lot of good research and there's good ideas that are in books, which you can buy and read them, but they're not necessarily for free. So I would take with a grain of salt anything that's for free floating around on the internet, forums and all of that. Like, people mean well many times. And then many times they keep asking the same questions. And I'm like, there's already like 8 research studies that are published, and you can go to this website, like what's called the Milo database, Center for Application of Psychological Type, the Myers-Briggs Foundation. Like, there are these places people can go to. And I'm like, you can just search for abstracts. Like, this research was already published and done. But yeah, it is a really good, it is a really good question, like where to start exactly and what is the person's level. I like the approach that my mentor, Dr. Linda Behrens, takes. She's a marriage and family therapist, but she's also worked in organizations for a long, long time. And she says that there's like different roads, to the same city of type. And if you're doing something with teams, for example, in organizations, it's very good to start with something called interaction styles. So there are just 4 interaction styles, and they're very visible in terms of the way people behave, like an in-charge style versus a sort of energetic, get things going versus the other 2. It's a little bit like DISC, actually. And that's one road. And she's like, then when they get comfortable with that, you introduce the needs and values model of temperament, and then you get 4 interaction styles times 4 temperaments equals 16 types. And that's one way to go about it. And Linda spent a lot of time like making sure she has very good definitions and presentation for things. Other people, and what's usually happens in organizations, is they take the MBTI or something similar, majors PTI, something like that. They get to 16 types, and then they get confused. Not because there's anything wrong with it, but the MBTI by itself, which actually does have a lot of research behind it and is valid, because the chance, yes, sometimes when people take it, they're going to get a slightly different type, but considering there are 16 options, it performs far, far better than chance. It really helps people. And the descriptions are actually very different. It's not like astrology at all. I don't know why people say that. You read them and are like, no, these are like extremely different descriptions, and because people can be very different. So that would make sense. The challenge with that approach, with just like this sort of dichotomies, left or right-handed kind of thing, is that it misses development. And so that's what I think when we go back to the internet, the nice thing is that they mainly talk about, we go back to Carl Jung and these mental functions, these 8 functions. And that very much is like, what is your stack, your hierarchy of preference, your pattern of functions that you use? How do you use them? Your first, second, and third functions are very important. They really define like 80, 90% of you, but let's not forget the rest. It explains like, yeah, we have options. We are many times extroverted, and when we are extroverting, a verb, we're doing this. And when we're introverting, then we're doing this other thing over here that's using a different function in a different way. The challenge is getting good definitions of those. And, I've made an effort through my books and research and talking to other professionals, trained in the type community, going back to Carl Jung. What did he talk about them? What kind of resources does the brain tend to use in the neocortex for people who prefer different functions? Yeah. And, I think that can help a lot, help us arrive at it. For people who want really crisp, definitive, simple definitions, we can give those, but remember that Jung intended his framework as a therapeutic tool and as a mandala. A mandala is like a painting that you keep coming back and you keep studying, and each time you come back is an opportunity to see something you didn't see before.
Yeah.
And to experience something you didn't experience before. Because the moment we just say, that this sensing function is only this, then that really limits what it can be to that time and place in history and to that person. And so, yeah, some people are very uncomfortable with an organic framework. And some people are extremely comfortable. It's the difference between an experimental psychologist who wants and I guess needs very crisp definitions, and a clinical psychologist who needs something organic and flexible. And the rest of us, even though we're not clinical psychologists, I'm not a clinical psychologist. When we're in everyday life is messy and organic, and so we need some flexibility in how we look at things. But there is a lot of work now to say, like, yes, these are 8 distinct processes, and there are like polarities in them, and there's basic and advanced use of each one, and these are all things which are statistically supported now.
Yeah, absolutely. Well, speaking of the functions, can you give a rundown of how this works? The the sort of 4 high level functions, and then how they break down into the 8, and something that I think a lot of people don't realize is this sort of higher level or advanced use of the function versus the basic use. The thing to remember is we use them all, right? It's like I use my left hand too, and I can practice it, with I can practice signing my name or catching things, right? But at the end of the day, when someone throws a ball in my face, it's going to be my right hand to the rescue, right? Because that's how dominance works. We have access to all of them, but we certainly use them in different ways. Yeah,
absolutely. So to sort of tell the story from the century-old story is that Carl Jung observed in his patients that some of them were more introverted and some of them were more extroverted. And he observed this along a spectrum as a trait. And he's like, this is helpful information to know. Some people are like really out there and sort of energetic and maybe loud and sort of overbearing or chaotic, like whatever it is. Some people are very reserved, like trying to get them to open up is like opening up a can of tuna. is not so easy.
Right.
And then he realized like how that this trait approach is just not enough.
Hmm.
And so he observed that there were 4 mental functions, and which he called sensing and intuiting, as ways that we perceive and gather information and interact with the world in a very just sort of flowy, open-ended way. Gathering information comes in, and we notice things, and we redirect our attention, and so on. And so sensing and intuiting, and then thinking and feeling are ways that people make decisions. And this was translated from German. So when I say feeling, he didn't mean feeling like, oh, there's a feeling. He talked about, he meant feeling in terms of making decisions based upon values and beliefs and convictions, as opposed to a yardstick of like a literal measurements, or some kind of framework or empirical data that says like, oh, students who get a 79.9 get a C plus, and those who get an 80.0 get a B minus. And then that's just like very da. That doesn't tell us anything about the student's effort or our feelings about the student and what they did, but it's very helpful to have that. So he observed these ways that people take in information and make decisions. And then he realized, well, everybody's doing some, like everybody does some sensing and some intuiting and some thinking and some feeling. Of course, all of us have values and beliefs. All of us at least try and be logical and objective at times. All of us notice things about the sensory world and take actions. What is the taste of an apple? What is the temperature in the water? All of that. How much money is on my bank account? That's a measure, but it's also a tangible thing, sort of. And then intuiting, which is all the abstract stuff that we can't see, and the patterns and ideas, and just the connect possibilities, the connecting things, the future, which hasn't happened yet.
Right.
This was a nice start. And then he realized that actually each of these 4 could be used in a more introverted way or a more extroverted way. So, for example, extroverted feeling, which is still a verb, there it's a process, is values and convictions and so on based upon what's around us. So societal norms, family norms, the feelings of other people, other people's likes and dislikes, social emotions, like gratitude and envy, that come up because of our social environment that are in. But he said if we just describe it that way, that's very limited, because there's an introverted feeling, which is about who am I, and what's important to me, and what do I believe, and how am I different from other people. And this feeling, the set of feelings that's come up inside of me, like how do I work with that and balance that out so that I'm not a hypocrite, or I'm not totally stressed out, or whatever it is. And that he saw then with the result is 8. So 4 mental functions, each of them focused in a different way on the outer world or the inner world. That ends up being 8, and that people invariably focus on 1 or 2 of those. A heroic self, a sort of a supporting actor that's there. Maybe a 3rd area, 4th area is the person like gets more developed and sort of balanced out in life experience. And then there are things we neglect. And I don't really see that as like a controversial understanding of the way we operate. It's seeing human beings as a system. And that's essentially where I would say where Jung left off, but keeping in mind that that part was only 1 chapter in a much larger book. And his goal as a therapist was to help people overcome one-sidedness. So the person who comes in and they do way too much extroverted feeling. So everything the person does is always about what's going on with other people. And, so that person thinks that. And Mary said to Joe, and, oh, they looked at me this way. And, oh, no, that person made me mad because. So they're living in a world, their experience becomes dependent upon the social environment of others. And he's like, that can become really unbalanced. that the person is just sort of, like a rag doll of the group and other people's opinions. So, and this is just one example of 8, how things go wrong. And he's like, how do we pull this person back to be like a healthy version of themselves?
Yeah.
And to bring in the strengths of all of that process and balance it out. So we saw, how do we overcome bias and how do we overcome imbalance?
Yeah.
And that was the meat of his work. And that's why I think type is so beautiful, because it's actually about dynamics, and it's like balancing the teeter-totter.
Exactly.
And to use like a simple analogy, it's like, how do we get things back in working order? If things are not functioning, that's dysfunctional,
Mhm.
how do we get them to function again?
Exactly. Yeah, I think there's, I mean, so many good points there. This sort of idea that we are this uh you know ecological system, right, where I think the thing to understand is that, like, no one person can have all the traits and all the skills and all the strengths. Right, there's literally, a coin, I like to say, can't be both heads up and heads down at the same time, right? And so to think that, like, every human is a self-contained, right, like, independent creature is, pretty silly, right? And so it makes sense, right, that people have kind of these sort of dominant ways of interacting with the world, right? These of interacting with the environment, so that, that's the first thing, their first instinct, and their strength, right? They were their gift. And so it's really interesting. I had an experience, like, speaking of um, the information intake or gathering functions, right? I was talking to someone with the opposite stack, ESFP, in one sense of being opposite, right? So the
Yeah.
reverse, right? It's the yeah. So 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8 versus 8, 5. 8, 5, 8, 7, 6, 5, 4, 3, 2, 1. Let me remember how to count. But and I remember, in speaking of these sort of like meaningful differences, I remember um, saying something like, "Man, I watched this YouTube video that made no sense to me. Like this, like, why would anyone be interested in this thing?" And it was so fascinating, because he said, like, I can't even remember the words he used, but he said he was so fascinated by that thing. It was a sensory kind of experience, right? An
Mm.
extroverted sensing. To me, that seemed so mundane, but he was kind of he seemed to see something beyond it. And it was actually one of the first times I kind of experienced this sort of like this gap in usage of a single function, where I'm like, I think I'm using the basic SE. There's something else he's doing when it comes to extroverted sensing that I'm it's invisible to me, like, I can use it, like, it's like I can, use my left hand, but there's a level of dexterity, right, that no matter, what kind of practice, I give it, it is not going to be there. And I think that's really, really interesting. And we're not meant to be all sort of the same, right? Where, everyone is, I think the default understanding is like everyone's an incorrect version of me, right? If they think differently, if they do, they took a different route, like, oh, that's not the optimal thing, right? It's not the optimal way to be. But this was very, very eye-opening, that I'm like, oh my gosh, like, I can almost see something before my very eyes that I can't see, um but yeah.
Yeah, that's something that came out from the data. I mean, so in developing the cognitive processes assessment with Professor Mina Barmani, um, that in analyzing that data, 130,000 people, and one thing that came out of it that was really strong statistically was the difference between basic and advanced use of a function. And Jung did talk about this. He used different language. He called it passive and active use. And I think we can still call it that. So an example of basic use, let's take extroverted. Let's actually say extroverted feeling again, because we've been using that as an example. So basic use of extroverted feeling is being nice, like knowing the right things to say, generally speaking, in a social situation.
Mhm.
Giving thanks to somebody who does something for you. When somebody does do something, like offering something in return, smiling, sort of knowing what are the social norms of the situation that I'm in and trying to meet those. It can get a little bit more advanced. We can ask people, like, what are your preferences and likes and dislikes? And then make some effort. It's like I'm going to buy gifts. Like, what kind of gift am I going to get for people? Like, let's think about, like, what do they actually like, not just what do I think they need. We're also considering, like, as I go into a room, even what brought people together into this room? People listening now, like, why are they listening now? Like, take a moment to at least think about that. Like, what do they value? Is it they value learning? Is it they value self-knowledge? Is it there's some value there? Like, how can I figure that out and sort of speak to that? That's a basic use, and maybe getting a little bit good with basic use. And most of us can do that. Sometimes we need reminding, but we can do, most of us can do this. Like, most of the people can do most basic use of functions when we're called upon to do it. And then that's where it leads to this sense of, like, oh, well, I can do all 8 functions. And I'm like, yeah, fat chance. It's not how it works. But I believe you can do basic use of all 8 functions. But the advanced use of extroverted feeling is really understanding how to, I want to say, massage and intervene in relationships. For example, acting as a mediator or a diplomat, being able to go in and sort of absorb the needs and the values of the people around you, the different parties that are involved who are in conflict with each other, because conflict is part of the human experience, and then finding bridges to build where they have shared values in common or shared needs in common, and speak to those, like speak up and name them. And there's a little bit of its opposite in there. So extroverted feeling brings in a little bit of its opposite, which is called introverted thinking, in this process as it gets to be more advanced, and really becomes a function that is used to solve problems, social problems, relationship problems, and then eventually at a point of being the kind of person who, say, is a mentor or is a leader who is speaking to people's needs and values and finding solutions to those, to create, like, more harmonious community, to create an environment where people all feel, I mean, we see this very much in society today. America for 20, 30 years has been, like, trying to practice extroverted feeling. I think it's doing a mediocre job. It can get used. But this idea of, like, how do we make everyone feel welcome and comfortable, and that as if they were guests, but also, family members or participants. You hear this a bit from the person who is, like, an executive at a company, or even a mom and pop store with their 5 employees, who says, yeah, we run this place like we're family. And that's one of those tip-offs that says, successful or not, that this is the approach that they're taking, that they really have this advanced use of this process. The hero does not always succeed. Unlike movies, sometimes the hero, meets insurmountable odds. But generally speaking, it behaves in a heroic way, and it really tries to really step up and bring all of its resources to bear to do what I would say, like, nurture and grow giving relationships, like interdependence, as opposed to, say, codependence is when the process goes terribly wrong.
Right.
Yeah.
It's interesting. The names of each functional position, right? That I think in John Beebe's model, he talks about and sort of the way I see his 3 levels of a function. It's almost like what you're called to do, or your purpose or your mission, is like the hero function. That's like kind of your primary goal. And then the other things are, or specifically the sort of auxiliary function, is meant to kind of support it, right? But and it's sort of like how you do it. I think he calls it the the self, the persona, and the or ego, right? Uses of the function. But the way it maps out, it's almost like, you seek to do this, right? Do your hero function at the highest level, right? Or you use the auxiliary function at the sort of advanced level in order to use the hero function at its highest level, right? I think from my extroverted intuition, right? It's to enable, right? And you can see that, right, in most sort of ENTPs, out there, right? They kind of create sort of systems and structures, right, in order to enable, right, this vision, right? And so that's kind of how one way I look at the interactions, right, between each function, in a person stack. But yeah, that's very fascinating. So yeah, so on this topic of a sort of a understanding your own functions and then how to nurture the most proficient use of each one where it is, right? Not try that's an important point, I think, to not look at someone whose dominant function is this thing you're trying to work on, right, and use it in the exact same way, right? Because it's not it's not where your function is, right? What are what are some ways to develop, right, to kind of map out a journey, your own journey of development, right, and using these functions, and using the knowledge that this is your stack, right, this is my hero function, right, this is what I appear to, this is kind of like my goal, my sort of true north, right, and here the second function is how I sort of take care of others, right, how I kind of consciously, right, go and make decisions, or in the case of a perceiving first type. Yeah.
Yeah, so that's the really the beauty of typology, and I specifically mean like Jung's framework with these 8 functions, is that it actually is a framework of change and development. It's not meant to just say, here's the static picture of this person, or here are their typical behaviors and traits. It is a developmental lever in order to know, what can we do and where can we go with this, and comes out of that like a long list of different ways we can approach it.
Mm.
I mean, one way, I'll try and march through like 4 or 5 of them just sort of quickly. One way is to simply have the language to know, oh wow, this is how I operate. This really helps in a way, just
Mhm.
to have a sense of this is how I operate, and that can be very energizing to people and validating, especially if they're in an environment which says, no, this is not the way you should do things.
Definitely. Yeah.
Just to be able to see and name who they are. Another thing which is very helpful is called perspective shifting.
Mm.
So to see like, oh, well, these other people that I'm working with, wow, they're very different. Instead of thinking those people are stupid or crazy, although there might be a very small percent chance they are a crazy version of their type. But for the most part, that's not the case. As the famous book title, I'm not crazy, I'm just not you. That this perspective shifting, even if we can't build a bridge to get along with the person, at least we have this understanding, and feeling this understanding and making room for other people is also part of growth. We always think of growth as like especially I feel like in the modern Western world, about skill building,
Yeah.
and skill building is fine. But learning how to make room for other people is also a
Mhm.
skill.
Yeah.
And it really is something that sounds passive, but is harder to maintain than people might think.
Mhm.
So perspective shifting, and part of the just making room for people, recognizing that at this moment in this situation, this person may be better to lead. Their hero is going to be better to lead than mine would. Another way is learning. Okay, so for example, years and years ago, I wanted to learn how to play guitar. I bought a guitar in order to make myself feel guilty if I didn't learn how to play. So I spent a lot of money on a guitar, um, which I still have and enjoy. And then one of my friends said, "Here, let me teach you." And he's a very different personality type than I am. We're different type preferences, and the way he plays and the way I needed to learn did not match at all. He's
Mm.
like, "Here, just watch me play." And then he handed the guitar to me and he's like, "No, you do it." I mean, simplifying, but that's
Right.
basically what it was. And I'm like, that's not going to work at all. And so I realized, well, I'm going to find somebody with the same preferences, like personality profile, as close as I can to me, but who already knows how to play. One 1 hour lesson with that teacher taught me enough to last for 3 years.
Wow.
And I'm like, that was the overview and the way I needed it explained to me. That was so powerful. It made such a big difference. So that's like a third way that we can grow, is a map of
Mm,
development. Another way is being aware of our opposite. And we don't know our opposite unless we have a framework and a way to name things, to point out, to make a contrast, to
yeah.
say, well, if I have these type preferences, then I know that there are non-preferences. And some of them are going to be really far away from me and are like counterproductive to try and, mimic them. But there are ones that are sort of in between that I can study some of that. I can hang around with some people who do those things. I can read about them. I can have now this language to understand what it is that they're doing and what it is that I'm seeing, um, and sort of figure out where does this fit for me in a satisfying way. Like, how can I develop my own version of this? And that can be really powerful, and then ties into Jung's concept, his principle of alchemy, which is really the bringing together
Mm,
of opposite ways of doing things in order to find a third way that is the solution, and solution having a meaning in chemistry, not just like the general meaning of the word,
exactly.
um, and discovering what is that, and
Mm,
and and that's going to be an individual journey for each person. Like, we can give suggestions, and in the Magic Diamond book, I give people suggestions, like, what does this typically look like, what are examples. Ultimately, it's up to you, but in terms of these alchemical examples of bringing together opposites, how do those then, when you do that, it's like you release something extra that wasn't there before. And,
exactly.
and so that's a really nice thing. And if we don't have a framework to talk about that, then we're just looking at a person being like, well, you should be more outgoing.
Right. Why aren't you more like me?
Which is basically more like me, and
Mhm.
which is really deeply unethical in a way,
Exactly.
and just like not helpful.
No.
If you want a person to be more extroverted, ask how do they extrovert, and you pinpoint
Exactly.
that, and then how can they get a little bit better at that thing that they're already sort of built in, and
Exactly.
and make that happen. This is where, like, I have some colleagues who suggest oftentimes people should work on their second function, their supporting function,
Mhm.
because it's underused. People have often a talent that they just sort of take for granted,
Mhm.
they just underuse it.
Yeah.
And it's like, if you just invested, like, literally, this literally happened to me, like a literal 5 minutes. I invested 5 minutes doing something from, like, what I know is my, like, supporting function. And all of a sudden, something that was a problem for like a year, just like, oh wow, the solution was just right there. It was like so easy for me to do. But it was just something I took for granted. But how do we name what it is we're taking for granted? How do we name what is our opposite? How do we name which is so in the shadow we're not even aware of it?
Totally. Yeah.
We need some kind of framework to do that, and that's what type
Mm.
provides, is this language and this lens, and ultimately a lever to make changes in our lives.
Yeah, it's like knowing what the different muscles are so you can
Yes,
make them
yes,
stronger, right?
exactly.
I'm trying to do this. I can't lift this thing. I don't know how to be able to lift it. Well, if you understand, right, what muscles are needed to lift that thing, right, then you work on developing. Then you learn, right, what a healthy or strong version of that muscle looks like, right?
Mhm,
And then work on it. I think that's one of the things, like the model that you mentioned. It's not passive, right? It's meant to be used, right? It's not meant to be okay. Take this test and then like we'll predict whether or not like you'll have a great life. Like, okay, now like
mhm,
you can marry a person of this type, right? It's not kind of, it's not like that, right? Because humans are complex, dynamic, living systems, right?
mhm,
And
mhm.
so, that is, you had mentioned kind of learning according to how you learn, right? Learning according to how you actually take in information and process it. That's I think is a great segue into type school and sort of this
Hmm,
right this this community and learning platform, right? Where literally the slogan is, right, learning with your mind in mind, right? And it's built exactly on that premise that what if we had someone explain or teach in the same way that a person learns, right? In a very sort of simplified way of kind of illustrating this, right, is if you take a person who learns with kind of definitions and systems and and understanding fundamentals versus someone who maybe teaches with stories, right? If this is misaligned, right, it can be really, the fidelity of information transfer can be really low, right? And we've all experienced this, right? Where like for some reason this teacher just never clicked, like and then I had this other teacher, right, where I switched classes, or my parent explained it and it just made sense, right? And it's like the material is still the material, right? And oftentimes it's not a difference in teaching ability or or understanding on the teacher's part. It's just the mismatch of cognition styles, right? And patterns. So yeah, so that's kind of how type school is born. And maybe in sort of wrapping up, we can talk about maybe next steps, and if anyone's curiosity has been piqued, I think there's a couple of really great resources that we offer for folks starting out, or folks that some folks have been studying it since 1994 or longer. We do have a free course that's an introduction to personality typology with the full context of it, the history of its development, right? I think that's sometimes overlooked in a cursory glance at this model. And then so that's available for anyone. If you just go to the Type School website, and we'll share a link in the show notes. You can register for a free account, and that's one of our sort of highlight courses. But we also have actually a live course coming up that's sort of the like type 201, right? If the free course is type 101. And this really gets into these cognitive functions that we talked about, right? Where we kind of show you what your blueprint is, right? What your map of like ideal you, optimal you, or just functioning you, I think for most people, right? Because we didn't get this manual, we're just kind of feeling our way towards being a functional version of ourselves. But do you want to talk a little bit more about what people can expect from this course? What sort of level of knowledge might be good to have, or even necessary at all to join this course?
Yeah. So I think it's really good for people to take a look at the 101 course, which is something that is, people can view on their own time, and is not even a whole day's worth of investment. It's just a few hours to be able to get up to speed, so that everybody who comes into 201 has a consistent terminology. Or if they really have no background in it, to sort of get up to speed a little bit, similar to the things we talked about today, but giving enough time to reflect and like actual things to read and resources to use. But the 201 class is, it's one thing to go out there and to read a book, and I put a lot of effort, and my colleagues do as well, out there to put together books and other resources that have balanced descriptions of things, have an engaging process, that help people along the way, but also ask them to take responsibility and reflect and do some homework and whatnot. Just like anything else important that we would want to do in life. The advantage of meeting together in a class, like a seminar style class, is that, and I say seminar because lecture is just like a book verbalizing stuff, and an AI can give a lecture today. And lecture is cute. It's sort of the old way of doing things. I like the seminar style a little bit more. And this is an opportunity with a smaller class, when you have a half dozen students or a dozen students, that everybody has time to like, oh, what are my questions? This is my personal experience. Here's a project that I want to work on. And I am very, like I said at the beginning, like my background is engineering, and many times I felt, teaching undergrads, it's like, well, you don't need to be graduate students in order to do a project, to take away something when you graduate, or even just, finish this class, that's like something you can hold up and say, I made this, or I did this, to have something tangible. So the class will meet, and we'll explore the 8 functions, looking at Jung's original words, because many times there's like arguments on the internet. Does it mean this or does it mean that? I'm like, just go read Jung, because it makes it really clear once you first, and I've taken the time to like sort what he said into like digestible chunks. because otherwise he's not super digestible. As well as like examples and activities and the research that's behind it and what does the research say. And not just about what applies to me or behaviors, but how does it show up in society? Because the psychology comes from the word psyche, and psyche includes more than just what thoughts in our head. Like, it includes the whole world around us.
Exactly.
And so there is this time to meet, to have a seminar style with learning and discussion, to do some homework, which is reading, but also some observing if you want to, and starting to work towards a project. It can be very small projects. There are many different options, and really making the material, yes, learning, and in a thorough way, and also internalizing it. So like, how
Yeah.
does this work? Because I think deep inside, people who are interested in the topic do want to find a way to make it their own, to make it useful, whatever it is, to be more than like, oh, this is such a neat idea, but how do I use it? So that's the
Exactly.
point of the project, is to help them find a way, their way in their life, of how they'll be using it.
I love it. Like lecture, discussion, and lab, kind of all in one, right? Like like back in school, right? Where in the lab you use it, right? You don't kind of read, map out or draw the chemical structures, right? You actually put the blue liquid with the red liquid and see what happens, right? And so, but in a safe environment, right? So, I think that's one of the things when you get to learn in a group, you can actually say like, well, here we all have this shared language, and I'm going to say this, or I'm going to do this, and maybe out there you might get an incendiary response, but here, we know we're learning, we're experimenting, or trying, right? So,
Yeah.
yeah.
And I would say there's one little secret bonus that people get, is that I've been in the type community, like I said, 30 years, and the people that my mentor, Linda Behrens, and others, I've met David Kiersey, like Mary McGinnis, like these people who go back a ways to the early 70s and even before that, and I have a lot of stories, and just like who did what and who contributed what and all these things, which mysteriously in all the dialogue on the internet, like in Reddit or whatever, you don't find these stories. You don't find this
Nope.
information. You
No.
only hear it from the old timers. I'm not quite an old timer yet, but I know the old timers, and I absorbed the stories, and I got my own stories. So those are also fun to share too.
Absolutely. Yeah. There's this field, for some reason, not that many people know about it, but history of science, right? And in every scientific discipline, there's kind of an accompanying field, which is the history of science, of that science. And a lot, it would surprise a lot of people to know that what we just think we know, and like why we know it and why we think we know it, has a lot more to do with the humans, doing the discovering and the teaching and the research and publication, than we think. It's not just like, oh, one day this knowledge was uncovered and like it was objectively just installed in everyone's minds. That's not quite, and so yeah, so that's definitely a really, really cool bonus. But yeah, well, thank you so much. This was really fun and super enlightening. But yeah, thanks everyone for tuning in. We'll shoot out an email with the show notes, and a link to join both courses. 101 for free and 201 with a special discount code. And yeah, hope to see everyone in class soon. And again, thank you so much, Dario, for being here.
Thank you. Absolutely.